The South African Communist Party, which is part of the Financial Sector Charter campaign in South Africa, has called for an urgent and full-scale investigation into the causes and the extent of the ballooning trend of unsecured loans. The organisation has expressed frustration with how the South African Reserve Bank has so far dealt with what they consider erroneous economic practice. Joining us now to unpack this call is Solly Mapaila. He's the chairperson of the Financial Sector Charter campaign. Mr. Mapaila, thanks so much for joining us here on Beyond Markets. A full-scale investigation you're calling for. Who, in your mind, is fit to conduct this investigation, and why is it important that this matter be dealt with at the level of an investigation? Are the regulatory authorities that we have at the moment not enough?
Well, we do have a regulatory framework, but they are more going down to the interests of the big four banks, which have now joined this reckless lending system. Ideally, the Financial Services Board should deal with this thing, as well as the regulator of the National Credit Regulator, which is primarily the one that should be dealing with this question. But we've seen now recently the maneuvers by the Treasury to try and usurp the powers of the National Credit Regulator to investigate the banks, particularly the big four and others that have now joined this particular market. But I think that it's quite clear that even the Reserve Bank itself is frustrated. They've recently expressed a concern that some of the reckless lending practices that they've previously denied have now almost ballooned out of control. And I think that the issue of the recent bank that was held before investigation, African Bank, was just the tip of an iceberg. But this is now a general practice. All major financial institutions have created a system of lending unsecurely.
Now, you, of course, are part of the broad campaign to get banking, aligned with the needs, not just of those who have huge bank accounts, but also the unbankable. Take us through how the issue around unsecured lending affects particularly poor people, especially when it relates to people being evicted from their homes.
What we've seen recently is a huge scam between the banks. What happens is that they will loan a person who owns a normal four-roomed house in a township some money when they know that this person has no capacity whatsoever to be able to pay back this money. Within a few months, they will come back and say they send different investigations to come and say they want to collect the money. And if you are unable to collect the money, or you are unable to raise the money, they then attach your house. And we have seen instances where people who have owed banks about 6,000 rands have their house repossessed. And the house are repossessed and then been sold for as little as 10 rands.
Now, you have access to the Banking Association. You engage with them on a number of issues. And the Banking Association, of course, represents these major banks and the financial institutions. Have you raised this issue with them, Mr. Mapaila? And what have you been able to get from them as a response to clearly providing credit to those who are not necessarily able to pay it back?
Well, firstly, the Banking Association, it's an instrument of the banks, of the big banks. It's unable to make them follow the rules and regulations. We've been frustrated with it, actually. But we've taken these matters up to NEDLAC for discussion at policy level so that we can strengthen regulations and the various framework in which they operate, particularly to protect the consumers. And in fact, the bigger issue here is also the conduct of the Treasury that is refusing to come on board to actually tell the big four banks that what they're doing is not right for the economy.
But why would you want the Treasury to intervene in what is essentially private banking institutions? How is it that the state is going to tell private banks who they can and can't lend to?
The Reserve Bank, the Treasury set the regulatory framework for all financial institutions in the country. Whether it's through the Reserve Bank, whether it's through the Financial Services Board, and now the credit through the National Credit Act and therefore the National Credit Regulator. All of those are instruments that we have created through struggle. That is why, in fact, our country was actually more spared than the rest of the other world when
This
they were
is exactly the point, Mr. Mapahila. When the financial crisis hit the rest of the world back in 2008, South Africa was spared a lot of the initial impact because everyone praised the regulatory framework of our banking system.
Which we fought for.
Are you suggesting that that framework is no longer in place? Why are our banks now vulnerable?
The framework is still there. The problem is that the government is unable to enforce the framework. That is why now they want to take over the National Credit Regulator, because it has started talking to the big four banks to tell them that what they are doing is not right. In fact, their attitude towards the African bank was the first thing, and we know now that there are other areas, other banks that are currently being investigated, and the Reserve Bank is aware about this thing. We raised this thing sometime last year.
Which banks are you aware of that are being investigated, Mr. Mapahila?
Well, that should be revealed by the National Credit Regulator itself. But we have had discussions with them, but it's not our platform to say so.
Now, of course, you've asked for a full-scale investigation. You've said that Treasury is now trying to usurp the role of the regulator. If Treasury is not going to be the institution leading this investigation, who, in your mind, will be a credible vehicle through which a process such as an investigation into the banks, who should be leading that?
Well, the National Credit Regulator is entrusted with constitutional responsibility through the National Credit Act to do so. But the problem is the attitude of the Treasury. So the Treasury first has to relax and allow this institutional capacity that we've created to do its work.
Are you planning to meet with Treasury soon?
Of course, we'll accept a meeting with them for as long as they accept, which we think that the minister now accept, but there have been some dubious calls from within the Reserve Bank accepting, not accepting, the fact that we actually could be plunged into a financial crisis because of the conduct of these financial institutions.